you have it, two possible scenarios that point to us having been created originally on Mars. Professor Benner stated, the evidence seems to be building that we are actually all Martians, that life started on Mars and came to Earth on a rock. It's lucky that we ended up here nevertheless, as certainly Earth has been the better of the two planets for sustaining life. If our hypothetical Martian ancestors had remained on Mars, there might not have been a story to tell.
Professor Benner stated, in addition, recent studies show that these conditions suitable for the origin of life may still exist on Mars. Man, that sounds like some good science.
You're listening to Canary Cry Radio. Here's Basil and Gons.
Hey everyone, welcome to Canary Cry Radio. My name's Basil.
And this is Gons. Welcome to episode number 61.
61.
Alright, well, back in episode 21, we talked about Mars. So that was, 40 episodes ago?
Yeah.
Well, we're going to do it again. And this time, we're actually going to get some help because our guest today is Douglas Woodward. He's an author, speaker, and researcher on the topics of the apocalypse, biblical eschatology. He has over 40 years of experience in researching, writing, and teaching on the subject. He's written several books. He has written Are We Living in the Last Days? Decoding Doomsday, Black Sun, Blood Moon, Power Quest Book 1, America's Obsession with the Paranormal, and Power Quest Book 2, The Ascendancy of Antichrist in America. And he co-authored The Final Babylon with Doug Krieger and Dene MGriff. And now he's here to talk to us about his new book called Lying Wonders of the Red Planet, Mars, Ancient Aliens, and the Great Deception of the Last Days. It's Douglas Woodward. How you doing, Doug?
Douglas Woodward.
I am good. Thank you, guys. This is the first official unveiling of the book, and so I've got several other interviews already scheduled, but this is the first, so hopefully it'll be the best, though.
There you go. You heard it here first. Canary Cry Radio exclusive.
There you go.
With Douglas Woodward. Well, good. We're really stoked that you're here, and I'm sure that you took the time to listen to episode 21, Canary Cry Radio, the Mars episode.
Oh, I did. I just wish I had listened to it much earlier because I could have quoted you guys in the book if I had.
Next time. Well, yeah, that was one of our famous episodes just because of how much incredibly mind-blowing ideas were in there. I mean, we had Obama going to Mars. We had all sorts of just outrageous claims. But, you know, I guess maybe we can clear a couple of those up here.
Well, I'll do my part. I have walked across the same paths that you guys covered very nicely. Uh-huh. And I've been listening to that program actually this morning to get myself sort of thoroughly energized. My appetite is fully whetted, so we will jump in.
All right, sounds good. Okay, so before we get into the book too deeply, let's ease into it here. How exactly did Mars become an important thing for you to have to express yourself creatively about?
Yes, great question. 2 or 3 threads. Certainly, the whole matter of UFOs has become, of course, a very, very big issue in our time. So hanging out with the likes of people like Tom Horn and L.A. Marzulli and so forth, coming across UFOs and the whole issue of the flying saucer cults and all that. That's a big factor. I was intrigued, and like many other folks, probably of similar mindset to us, was sort of sucked into the History Channel's Ancient Aliens TV show, and so became a dutiful watcher or viewer of that. Have to be careful when you say watcher. A dutiful viewer of that show. And was very fascinated. Then I had done a lot of research on 2012, and there's a huge overlap between sort of the New Age 2012 UFO, aliens as gods kind of mythos. And so I kept hitting across that. And then, I think probably the book, Richard C. Hoagland, Mike Vera, Dark Mission, that really got me very interested in it. And so, I'm probably like a lot of other writer researchers, not that there's a lot of us out there, but there are a few, and And when you stumble across something that you get just intensely curious about, you really want to start reading and researching. And so I've been doing that, and have read dozens and dozens of books on Mars, and I began to gain a historical perspective. And that historical perspective has led me to certain conclusions. And the story you guys talked about a year ago is only one of a couple of dozen fantastic stories associated with the planet Mars, and really gives us some perspective on the whole ancient alien phenomenon in our current day. So that was kind of how I got to where I am now.
Awesome. Now, let's just start to ease into the book here. You start out the book kind of with the ancient aliens, Antichrist, one world religion. That's actually the name of the first chapter there. Right. Why was that kind of the jumping off point? Is that really as the shallow end of the pool there?
Well, I think that the thing I try to do in my books is give people context, because from context, you usually gain some better understanding. And if someone were to just start watching the ancient alien thing, you would think it's like, these guys invented sliced bread. It's like this is the first time that this has come about. And the reality is that the whole phenomenon of ET as God is a cyclic kind of phenomenon in our culture, and it really connects to much deeper issues such as spirituality and what's true about religion and what's not true. But just as I wrote the first chapter, and I found myself really talking about kind of the political situation in the world, and it just struck me that this whole thing sets up as the future one world religion that eschatologists have been predicting would come to pass. And of course, I know traditionally Protestants have said, well, it's the Catholics, and Catholics have said, well, it's the Protestants that are really, the evildoers, and it's their falsehood that will be the final deception, the great deception of Babylon, and so forth. But if you postulate for a moment, which many of us in this sort of this realm, we kind of believe that the Lord is returning soon, perhaps within a decade, perhaps 2 decades, and you sort of say, well, okay, if that's true, assuming that for the sake of argument, then you start asking questions. You say, well, who is Babylon? And obviously the last book, The Final Babylon, we talk about America as the final Babylon. And in this book, really assuming that the final one world religion is a religion based upon ET, based upon extraterrestrials.
Right.
And so the context really was, well, in America over the last 5 or 6 years, we've had this, to some extent, it depends, of course, your political views, but a lot of hero worship around our president. Mm-hmm. And, it just struck me, his book, The Audacity of Hope. I thought, well, maybe the right response, given what's happened, especially over this last summer with all the revelations about Edward Snowden and the NSA and Big Brother spying on us and all this stuff, was, well, that hope has been sort of ground into dust. It's the audacity of hope in America. It's really the paucity of hope in America.
Right.
That president, and this is, it's a tough job, right? It's a hard job. I don't think I'd want it. But there's no question that 5 years ago, when President Obama was elected, there was a tremendous amount of optimism and belief that he was going to work miracles. And it's been, kind of no surprise that a lot of people have conjectured that he might be the Antichrist. Well, I never say that. I always look pretty carefully when someone goes and stands in front of the Berlin Wall and talks to 200,000 Germans and talks about how exciting the world's going to be, and you have commentators talk about this is not just the future president of the United States, this is the future president of the world. Those things get my attention, and and then when he goes into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, they have a statue of him carved in ice, and he's proclaiming, alliance, peace in our time, the unbreakable alliance between Israel and the United States. These kinds of things make you think, well, I guess he's a candidate. So he's a good family man, but I guess he's a candidate, just given some of those strange things. So anyway, that's the context.
Okay. Now, just real quick, there's been a lot of stuff on ancient aliens. Chris White did his debunking ancient aliens and things like that. Where do you kind of veer from the, how do I put it? The secular ancient aliens theories?
Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, because, you cite Jason Colavito quite a bit at the beginning there, and, he's written extensively on the topic as well. And you also bring up, you mentioned Ignatius Donnelly. Where does he fit in? Because, it's interesting to see, you touch on it briefly, of where this whole ancient aliens thing got started. Because I think most people know about the History Channel. They kind of know, some of the Graham Hancocks and the, some of the other authors that have written on similar topics. But where do you think this whole idea really originated from?
Yeah, well, that really brings us to the subject of Mars. And Jason Colavito and I had I don't know if you guys saw it yet, but we had a series of sort of back and forth debates that were going on kind of in his blog and in my blog. And there was quite a bit of activity on the internet about that. That happened a couple of months ago. I actually find the guy to be he's a smart guy. He's intelligent. He's a naturalist, as far as I can tell. He's an atheist. And of course he sees the whole ET, ancient alien thing is just it's a crazy falsehood that was originated predominantly by H.P. Lovecraft, who wrote great, really dark Gothic horror back in the 1920s, 1930s. And my point is, I agree with him that it is a pseudo-religion, but I disagree with him that Lovecraft by himself is really the genesis of the whole notion of ancient aliens. It certainly goes far beyond that, but if you really pick it up in modern times, about 140, 150 years ago, it really begins to come into focus in the whole issue of Mars. And Mars was and has been a predominant kind of theme or motif of this whole ancient aliens thing, really for well over a century. And so that's kind of another kind of seminal point to begin the book, is to say, it's important to understand the context of where ancient aliens, came from. This is not just a TV show of the last 5 years. It goes back to Rod Serling, to In Search of Ancient Aliens, In Search of Alien Astronauts. Eric Van Daniken, right about the same time that Hal Lindsey was writing The Late Great Planet Earth, Van Daniken had written Chariots of the Gods, ? And so all this kind of fits into pop culture and has a big influence upon our society. And it happened that Mars had always been a great curiosity, the source of mythology, the source of tremendous stories and speculation. It had always been there, and it became more important with the advent of the telescope, as we could see Mars more up close and personal. And then really with the so-called sort of death of God, as God became less and less believable from sort of the intelligentsia's perspective, the Enlightenment and so forth, sort of what happened is that God gets kind of ushered out of the discussion. And so humankind, as it is wont to do, is trying to find a substitute. And so we began to say, well, we had to come from somewhere. So maybe we came from some other world, from some other place in the universe. And the concept of panspermia became a big issue. And that concept, by the way, is thousands of years old. It goes all the way back to the Greeks. But nevertheless, that really, is the context of this discussion. It's Mars, and it's what's been going on, and kind of how Mars and ancient aliens all has kind of a confluence and comes together as really a pseudo religion, arguing that we originated either on Mars, which is kind of what Richard C. Hoagland, Mike Barra, and many others believe, Graham Hancock, or we certainly came from someplace else.
Right. Yeah, because it's interesting because we mentioned in the other episode that we did, the first episode on Mars. Uh-huh. I think it was Basil that mentioned how, in pop culture, it's almost like they've made Mars this sort of goofy, some of those movies, the old time movies, and you have some of these kid movies, and it's like, Mars. Yeah. So Attack from Mars. Yeah. So there's this kind of, weird stigma of like, oh yeah, that silly notion that we came from Mars or that there's life on Mars. But I think you succinctly put it in your thesis that you state here in the book, and I think it's page 19 or so. You said that your thesis is that for almost 150 years, Mars has been the primary catalyst within popular culture, spawning false religions fabricated on the basis of belief in extraterrestrials. Today, other factors influence the theory, such as the burgeoning awareness of UFOs and countless dramatic sightings. Nevertheless, I predict Mars will soon impact this phenomenon in a big way yet again. Do you think, let's move in a little bit to some of the things going on now. So, obviously what sparked our last episode was the Mars Curiosity rover. They made a big deal about it.
Right.
What do you think is going on as far as, NASA and some of the things they're trying to do to discover or do on Mars?
Mm-hmm. Well, one element of your prior question I really didn't hit was Ignatius Donnelly, and he was a Minnesota congressman who actually began to write. He wrote a book on Atlantis, and one of the key themes that you see in this whole study of ancient aliens and UFOs is that it kind of goes back and forth between flying saucer technology and outer space versus a concept of an ancient advanced civilization on Earth, usually called Atlantis. It was really part of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, eventually kind of infiltrated Nazism and so forth. But Donnelly's idea of Atlantis and ancient civilization, that was another key element. And you'll see this going back and forth in the Ancient Alien stuff. Is Ancient Aliens, the TV show, the flash pictures of flying saucers on the TV, but their real focus is to look at archaeology and anthropology, is to look at the sciences of artifacts. And It's to look at the sort of the proof of the past. How do you explain these things? How do you explain the pyramids? How old is the Sphinx? So you spend more time really focused on ancient history than you do really, how might we propel a flying saucer with Nikola Tesla technology from here to Mars. So a lot of it is more anthropology, archaeology. And so then you ask the question, well, what are we doing on Mars? And, why was NASA involved and so forth? Well, the argument that Hoagland puts together in Dark Mission and Beyond, The Monument of Mars, and Mike Barra has written a couple of recent books, Aliens on Mars, Aliens on the Moon, where they really focus a lot, of course, on photographs. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to demonstrate that there are artifacts, literally facts of art, or evidences of human or intelligent handicraft, that somebody made something. And if we were to go out there and kick over enough rocks, we're eventually going to find something out there, and of course, I jokingly in my presentation, I kind of zero in on a patch of ground and keep getting closer and closer until I show a can of Coke from 1950 out there. So I sort of jokingly say that, well, maybe Andrew Basiago decided he was drinking a can of Coke when he was teleported back to Mars and he left it there for us back in 1950. And so the question is, all right, so if we were to discover, and this is really what the Brookings report talked about in 1960, big headline in the New York Times, warning scientists reveal that we may encounter evidences of ancient life on the moon or on the planets of the solar system. And so, some would say, and in fact, there's an argument for it, based upon Werner von Braun and his issues and so forth, what he was wanting to do, that there's a desire to go out there and find these artifacts on the moon or on Mars that demonstrate that, hey, intelligent life once existed here. It may have been thousands of years ago. It may have been millions of years ago, but it's there. And if it's there, it proves, we're not alone in the universe. And then it raises all kinds of questions, particularly if those artifacts resemble ancient civilizations on Earth. And what is the dominant feature that is discussed? Well, certainly the face on Mars, which is compared to the Sphinx of Egypt, but also much more so than that, and much more widespread, is the concept of pyramids. And so you see lots of photographs of pyramid or pyramid-like shapes on Mars, and of course that's really the jumping-off point for Hoagland and for Graham Hancock and others is to talk about this connection between Earth and Mars, a connection that is really highlighted by the pyramids.
Yeah, definitely. I recall, and I think in our episode we talked about Andrew Basiago's groundbreaking PDF document that supposedly showed these, creatures or whatever. And, I can't remember all the creatures that they talked about. It was
great. You had a nice menagerie there of all these different,
a dolphin just sort of
says the surface of Mars. Yeah. The surface of Mars is just kind of like this sort of collection of statues.
Right.
It reminded me a little bit of C.S. Lewis's, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where the children are walking through the ice statues. And they see all these creatures frozen out there, and it was kind of almost that comical.
Yeah.
And of course we'll talk more about Basiago and his issues here in a second. But it is a strange way to prove a thesis, to go look at a bunch of different rocks and say, it's a little bit like Charlie Brown and Lucy, looking up at the clouds and saying, well, no, that one looks like, the King of Prussia.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Now you did mention Basiago, and Basiago is an interesting just concept for me, because I'm the kind of person that, I want time travel to be real so badly. And I want, if that was real and he was true, that would be so awesome. But it's so just hilariously not. And so, I mean, what are you what do you have on this guy? What have you found?
A lot of things, but you hit upon what I think is really a core issue that we've got to keep in mind as we approach the whole issue of ancient aliens, and that's this issue of romanticism.
Right, exactly.
Ray Bradbury, there's a quote of Ray Bradbury. He basically says, "Humanity starts with romanticism and moves towards realism."
Right, exactly.
And and that is so true, especially for those of us that believe in spiritual realities. We believe in intelligent design, and we believe that the providence of God is evident in our lives personally, and we sort of have a sense of fairy tale, that everything works together for good to those that love God, to those that are called according to His purpose. And so we see design, and we want to see design in all these things. And so we're sort of predisposed to believe. And, whereas the naturalist, let's say, is predisposed not to believe.
Right.
So, Hoagland looks at a colorful rock on the Martian surface, and he says, gee, that rock looks like a tennis shoe. And from that, he's ready to rewrite all of human history and to say, well, clearly, because of this rock shaped like a tennis shoe on Mars, we should just realize that we all were Martians before we were Earthlings.
That's a great way to put it. We should all just realize this.
We
guys.
should just see, can't you see that tennis shoe? And so, it's not, by the way, I'm not as you'll see as we talk, I'm not a complete skeptic, but the reality is that, if for every 1 point of real proof, there are 10 points of hokum.
Right.
Hokum and, and hoaxes. And so, that's why you have to measure everything very, very carefully and kind of non-committal. But yeah, Basiago, of course, is a great study in and of himself, and it leads to all kinds of issues. The little selection of the book that I sent you guys, I didn't include the write-up on him, but we can certainly talk about him. But yeah, jump rooms, underground military bases, a vast colony of 500,000 humans already living on Mars. Right. Basiago teleporting back and forth in 15 minutes from the Earth to Mars, and meets up with Barry Soetoro on the surface of Mars.
Right.
And, this stuff goes beyond mythology. I mean, it
I know, it's so funny.
It is a remarkable story, and you can't help but love the guy just because he's willing to stand out there in public and say things.
Oh my
and
gosh.
Absolutely believes them, and we'll talk more about maybe why he believes them in a minute. But it is it definitely catches our interest, and that's kind of come back to the point. Well, why would you say, Woodward, that Mars is going to have another big impact upon society, pop culture, whatever? Well, it's because these kinds of stories, they may get more intense. There may be more and more factors that these guys pull out that, what if they could really prove that Basiago really was there listening to Lincoln, give
right.
Gettysburg Address, and he really was able to prove that he was there. Wouldn't that lend credibility to everything else he says?
Mm-hmm.
And, and then probably taking a really big far step back and putting this in perspective, we're going to encounter, if this is the last days, we are going to encounter a belief system that is so amazingly, it's provocative, but it's so incredible. And guess what? There's all this proof that says that it's true, such that, as Jesus said, that if possible, even the elect would be deceived.
Right.
And so you sort of say, whatever the one world religion is, it's got to be amazing and it's got to be provable to some extent, because it's not going to just be a few crazies out here that go around talking about ancient astronauts with weird hairdos, right?
Right.
He's a Lucas, or however you pronounce his name. But that it's a mainstream idea, and for it to be a mainstream idea, there's got to be a lot of proof. And so, so part of the reason for writing the book is get ready,
Right.
it's coming.
Yeah.
There's going to be a lot of really wacky things that are going to be proven true, and guess what? It's going to shake up the religious systems, and the belief systems of everyone in the world.
Right, and it's
Right.
interesting how it seems like the Catholic Church, with some of the work that Tom Horn and Chris Putnam has done, it's almost like they're getting ready for that. They're sort of preparing the religious masses to accept this sort of thing.
Yes.
But you have one of the, I guess, subchapters about the jump rooms, time travel, and military bases. This one jumped out at me: comic books and the CIA. What's that about?
Yeah, this is where the rabbit hole begins to open up and begins to swallow you. The story I tell in the chapter is I start off talking about Argo, the movie that was Best Picture in 2012, written, acted, Ben Affleck, and so forth. And I have to thank Nick Redfern, who does a lot of great research, and so this is certainly his scoop, not something that I stumbled across by myself. I just stumbled across it in his book. And then I researched it, and it turned out to be, lo and behold, it was true. There was a real movie, a movie script, a book that had been written called The Lords of Light, that was the real name. It wasn't Argo or the Argonauts, but it was Lord of Light. And it was written, by a guy back in the 1970s, and it was a concept of there being sort of aliens in space. And the guy that wrote it was kind of taking more of a Buddhist kind of motif and kind of mixing that in with outer space, and that was kind of the Lord of Light. And of course, you say that, and we all know who we think of, and we think of the Lord of Light. Probably not Jesus Christ, but probably Lucifer. And so there's that thing. But then what was really intriguing in the connection was this guy named Jack Kirby. He was a friend of Stan Lee, and they had written comics, had done comics together. And this guy named Jack Kirby had done, a number of comic books, and he actually did a comic book in 1958. And I actually have a picture of it in the book when I share the rest of the book with you guys. From 1958, and the title of the comic book was "The Face on Mars," and this he has these people going to Mars, and they walk upon and stumble upon this giant face that lies across the ground, looking up into space, and they go in through the eyes of this face, and they walk down into this vast underground cavern that, lo and behold, it's chock full of all kinds of advanced technology, machines. It has pictures. As they study it, it tells the story of an ancient alien race that happened to be humanoid. And, because kind of like in Star Trek, every creature in outer space is humanoid and has two eyes and two ears.
Right.
And they all speak English.
Yeah, we all evolved the same way. And so, but there's all these pictures and evidences that this group was from some other planet, and they study it more and more, and they learn that they had to escape because they were under attack, and they came to Mars and they built this underground base, and they had the face on Mars as its idea, a motif on top, and all that. So you go, now wait a second, this is 1958. Well, and then what was the Jack Kirby connection was that the CIA went to Jack Kirby, and they had him when they were doing the mission to Tehran. They had Jack Kirby do the artwork for Lord of Light, which was, of course, Argo. The fictional thing was Argo. And but it turns out that there really was a connection between the CIA and this comic book in the 1950s. And turns out that's not the only example from the 1950s that goes into this motif of Mars, ancient civilizations, and even pyramids. There's a guy named Endo Binder, Binder, but his real name was Otto Binder. He used a pseudonym, and I can't pronounce his first name. But he did a book around 1970, where it called, I think it was The Pyramids from Space, or The Pyramids on Mars. And so you've got the same sort of mythos appearing again, where you have these pyramids being found on Mars. And your listeners may recall it really wasn't until about 1976 with Viking 1 that the photograph first came back that showed what looked to be a face on Mars. Right. And so, it wasn't until about 1976 that this idea was sort of, at least it was kind of grafted into or ingrained in a photograph graphically. Right. So, but you had all these other things happening almost 20 years before. The CIA was involved in it, and it had the same sort of mythos, and that just opens the door to a whole bunch of other stories and a whole bunch of other testimonies. Basiago's is one, William Cooper's is another. This whole theory that we were on Mars, in the 1960s, and we did colony on Mars there and so forth. So it turns out that the rabbit hole gets very wide and very deep, and we just barely touched on a number of things by covering those issues.
I know there's so much to touch on. We're just gonna keep throwing it around here. Now, here's something that I would love to hear about. Earlier in 2013, we had an interview with Stan Deo, and he told us about a story where he was, kind of in a warehouse of the scientist who was working on something, and he kind of stumbled upon like a satanic altar. And you have a section of the book here called "A Rocket Scientist and an Occult Priest." Yeah.
Jack Parsons.
Right.
Right. Yeah. Actually, in the book, I start off touching about Jack Parsons, and there's a whole lot to his story, but he was the founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. The locals refer to it as the Jack Parsons Laboratory. But JPL, of course, is a major portion of the NASA institution. It's located in Pasadena. It turns out I actually have a family connection to the whole Curiosity story. I have a niece married a guy who works at JPL out in Pasadena. This is my brother's son-in-law, basically. Mm-hmm. And he was a project manager, and he was the guy that was involved in working on the you know how you guys, I think, talked a bit about this in your program a year ago, where as Curiosity, as the Mars roving laboratory was getting ready to land, it sort of opened up, and it kind of like a crane. It dropped down the payload, and then it sort of lowered the payload kind of down, kind of like a forklift almost. And well, it turns out, sort of my nephew-in-law, if you will, was actually the project manager for, one of the key mechanisms.
Wow, sky crane. That's
so
cool.
Yeah. So I could talk more about that. But anyway, interesting, just kind of synchronicity there. So, right. All right. So, so going back to Jack Parsons. So Parsons, in addition to being a rocket scientist, and he was kind of the key guy that figured out about solid rocket fuel. he was enamored with a German rocket scientist named Willy Ley, who was a friend and cohort with Werner von Braun, even when Ley and von Braun were still in Germany, designing rockets to fire at London. There were a couple of Americans, Jack Parson, before him, Robert Goddard, that had done a lot of great work in rocket science. Parson was the guy that kind of came up with solid rocket fuel. And by the way, they named it Jet Propulsion Laboratory instead of like Rocket Propulsion Laboratory because rockets were all associated with Flash Gordon, and they had no credibility. Nobody believed rockets could really be fired, and so that's why they call it the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Well, anyway, so of course another theme you see, which is always interesting, is the intersection between scientists and the paranormal. So scientists, many scientists sort of have this sense that, that there really is this sort of connection between the paranormal and advanced technology. It's like, was Arthur C. Clarke that said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Right.
Well, and you sort of see that paradigm throughout, anybody that's really into this super advanced technology is that they sort of all believe there really is some kind of a mechanism that drives it, and yet until you really understand it, it's just magic. Well, so anyway, Parsons was into Ordo Templi Orientis, the OTO, which was founded originally by a guy named Aleister Crowley. And the whole Crowley story is another one to give us a lot of perspective, because Crowley believed in, he actually orchestrated and created a religion called Thelema, or Thelema, depending upon how you pronounce it.
Right.
And since I don't attend their meetings, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. So, but it was very much a religion based upon satanic, deep Enochian magic, John Dee, very, very ritualistic, sexual magic, and so forth. Well, anyway, Parsons became sort of the high priest while he was out in Pasadena, and so he in effect was connected with Aleister Crowley. Crowley has a whole series of his own interesting stories. He was connected with Ian Fleming during the war. We could go down a complete trail there with just talking about the connections of Aleister Crowley and all that Crowley did. But nevertheless, Parsons, getting back to him, Parsons was very involved in helping to sort of generate the whole issue of science fiction. He used to have a meeting at his house. They jokingly called it the parsonage. For those of us that know about preachers and their homes, lots of times churches furnish a home for their pastor, and they call it the parsonage. Well, anyway, so you had guys like Robert Heinlein, Ray Bradbury, and then you had this guy named L. Ron Hubbard. These guys were all part of this science fiction club. They had all just begun to start writing science fiction, and this was in sort of the 1940s. And then early in the 1940s, and then later, you see Jack Parsons actually going out in the Mojave Desert, and I forget who it was with him, but it was one of his other cohorts. The two of them performed this very deep Enochian magical ritual called Babylon Working, in which they were trying to conjure up a moon child, or the Whore of Babylon. And so, I could go into more detail on the story, but long story short, supposedly this conjuring works. Parsons goes back and he meets this redheaded woman that just shows up at his doorstep. She becomes, I think her name was Marjorie Cameron. She becomes sort of his, Babylon, Whore of Babylon. L. Ron Hubbard becomes more significant in the story. He actually runs off with Jack Parsons' wife to Florida. Hubbard boasts that he's going to create a religion based upon extraterrestrials, and he does. It's called Scientology. Hubbard probably was a Navy spy sent originally into Jet Propulsion Laboratory to spy on Parsons and one of his German cohort, Theodor von Karman. Just worried, the Navy was worried that, well, maybe these secrets are going to get back to the Germans, and goodness knows we've got Germans firing enough rockets at us already. And, and so the stuff just gets deeper and deeper, and pretty soon you become convinced that there really is something going on here. These people really are doing some real conjuring, and some real things are happening. And of course, I could jump over and talk about Nick Redfern, his concept of the Collins elite, and their whole story, which gets back to Jack Parsons, Babylon working, the ritual, and an alternative explanation for what happened at Roswell in 1947. So the nice thing about the book is it does deal with this in a more organized way than sort of my stream of consciousness here.
Yeah, well, it's all good.
No, same with us, too. We're kind of jumping around here, but that's okay. It just makes people want to go get the book even more.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, I know. It'll be out in just a couple more days. I don't know when this show will be aired, but maybe it'll be available out on Amazon when it is.
Cool.
Okay,
yeah, it should
good.
be. Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard, I mean, I actually cite one of their rituals, if you will, or alleged rituals. It's not really clear, but in my my upcoming film, Age of Deceit 2, Alchemy and the Rise of the Beast Image, I talk about this thing called the mannequin that they worked on, and actually the Brookings Institute released a short explanation of this thing called the Jumbo back in February of 2013, where basically the explanation they gave was that General Leslie Groves, who was actually the head of the Manhattan Project, they were worried about, what would happen when they did their first, nuclear explosion test, right, out in New Mexico. Yes. So they created this thing called the Jumbo. They spent $142 million on it, and it was this 214-ton, 25 feet long, 12 foot wide, huge, 14-inch thick wall thing. And, some of these conspiracy and occult investigators actually said that what they were trying to do was actually create a golem,
right.
like an inanimate human being, or, a soulless body, if you will.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of speculation and weird stuff going on there. But of course, the official explanation is, we didn't want a nuclear leak. But that's what they're telling us.
Yeah.
So, but I think Basil had a question about Nikola Tesla.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
My boy Tesla. Everybody who listens to the show knows I'm a Tesla enthusiast.
Yeah.
And so, what's the connection there? What do you got for me?
Well, okay. Well, Tesla. I do a chapter where I talk about Nikola Tesla and Marconi. Is it Giovanni? I think it is. No, Guglielmo. Guglielmo. I can't say that very well. It's not one of those diphthongs that we Englishers do well. But anyway, it's claimed Marconi and Tesla. Well, both these guys around 1895, 1897, 1900, they both were working on radios, and they both might claim, usually Marconi is given the credit for being the first inventor of the radio.
Right.
And Tesla, actually was very involved in doing that as well. And of course, Tesla was working on, those listeners that might have seen the movie The Prestige,
right.
This guy out there in Colorado Springs testing lights and turning lights on wirelessly, and of course, Tesla was doing all kinds of things that most of which is still classified today because we don't want the information that he, the stuff that he developed and thought of to get out to our enemies, but which of course it may already have.
Disrupt the system. Yeah.
Yes, but anyway, so I have a chapter called Radio Contact with Mars, and so both Marconi and Tesla were public. Tesla wrote an article, and I think it was in Collier's Weekly in 1901, in which he talks about his first contact with intelligence from Mars via his wireless radio. Now, mind you, the radio had really just been invented. It was just still, people were still convinced that there was no way that we could communicate signals, wirelessly. The telegraph obviously was communicating signals via wire, and the telephone was beginning to, jingle a little bit. And so we had wired connections, but wireless connections, that was just crazy.
Right.
In fact, when Marconi sent his patent application in to the head of patents in Italy, the guy scribbled on the top of his patent application, "Straight to the asylum." So, it was just not possible to do wireless communication. So anyway, these guys both are inventing wireless communication, and all of a sudden, Tesla says he's working alone in his laboratory. It's dark. It's in the middle of the night. He starts getting this radio signal. And he starts explaining how, he could pretty well map different electronic signatures from different, things that were going on in the world, thunderstorms, whatever. But there was a sort of background signal that he was picking up, and it had a pattern to it. And so he basically explains that he decided it had to be from intelligence, it had to be off-world, and so he became convinced it was from Mars. And supposedly Marconi had similar experience. And so you had these two guys that were here. We are 1901. What's happened is in pop culture at the time, the telescope has become very powerful. Percival Lowell has been out campaigning now for about 5 years on given his views of what he's seen as he's looking at Mars. Guys named Pietro Secchi in like 1870, and then it's Giovanni Schiaparelli that actually invented the term canal or canale, not cannoli, but canale. and so you got Lowell. He gets very enthusiastic. He hears that Secchi's losing his eyesight, so he starts really studying Mars, and he has kind of a paranormal interest anyway. He had just gotten back from Japan in 1894. He had done a study on the occult in Japan, so he was kind of into this really weird and stuff that was on the fringe. And so he's got people in the culture pretty well excited, believing that there's evidence, that they see these markings on the surface of Mars, and they appear to be straight lines, and some of them are double lines, and it looks like that, there's polar ice caps, they can make that out, and there seems to be seasonal changes on Mars. And so you've got everybody on Earth now convinced that there really is intelligent life on Mars. And so Marconi and Tesla come along, and they start saying they're communicating wirelessly with intelligence on Mars. And, you had to be really one of the top skeptics to just dismiss all this. Right. It just seemed to be too obvious. Of course there's intelligence, and they're talking to us now, and so then that's, then along comes pulp fiction, and science fiction gets invented within 20 years, and bingo, for the next 40, 50 years, you've got this massive infusion of the concept of ancient aliens, life on other planets, and so forth and so on. So that's kind of where Tesla fits into this, notwithstanding, of course, his whole issue about, I didn't really talk about his concept of pulse radio waves versus sort of analog sound waves, and then his theories of propulsion that could have gotten us to and from Mars, So Tesla fits in a lot of different ways. But the wireless, publicly talking about wireless communication with Martian intelligence, that really stimulated a lot of interest in in pop culture.
Good old Tesla.
Yeah, and it's interesting how the telescope. It seems like we just did an episode on the moon, and all sorts of crazy theories were happening after looking at the moon with
some pretty similar theories, actually.
If you're willing to go down these rabbit holes, it becomes an art form almost to see how wild, crazy.
I like that. I like that, and I think that's what, especially with the moon episode, and also with the Mars episode. I think me and Gans have really found our true art form in going into those sorts of things.
Well, you do mention, I think early on in the book, some of the pages you sent us, you do mention that there is this sort of prerogative of the human imagination, and it was sort of a God-given gift, so to speak, that we should embrace to some aspect. We shouldn't ignore it completely.
No, not at all. Not at all. It partially gets back to the Romanticism question.
Right.
And another subject that I talk about, which is kind of cutting-edge science, but it is right on the fringe as well, and that's the issue of how much does our mind, or collectively, do our minds together help to create reality versus just perceive it?
Yeah.
And so, that kind of gets into the same realm as time travel and all that. It really begins to be a mind bender. But science is beginning to, what I do is I talk about it in the context of UFO manifestations. And I pose the question about Jack Parsons and his parsonage group, all these science fiction writers all coming together, the rituals that Parsons did, but just all of the books that began to be written in the 40s, and all of a sudden, 1947, you've got these sightings. Kenneth Arnold, and then the Roswell crash, the Washington flap in 1952, that gives basically motivates the first 3D outer space terror movie, right after that in 1953. And so, the question is, to what extent does our expectation, does our belief in the phenomenon help to create the phenomenon?
Right.
And so, that itself is an intriguing issue. I go into quite a few stories. I talk about one of my favorite characters, Andrija Puharich, who did a lot of research in the 1940s and 1950s on behalf of military intelligence, the CIA, a lot of mind control stuff. He was actually the guy that discovered Uri Geller in a Tel Aviv nightclub in 1970. He brought him back over to Stanford Research Institute, where Hal Puthoff and what's the other guy's name? Two of the physicists they were kind of the lackeys for the CIA at Stanford, and they were doing all this research. But anyway, Puharich was up to his earlobes in that, and the whole study of Puharich and the concept of the Egyptian Aeneid, the 9 gods. This takes us down into some other really intriguing things that includes Gene Roddenberry from Star Trek, John Denver, the whole concept of the 9. In fact, Peter Levenda, one of his first books talking about America and the occult, his subtitle is the 9, and he's referencing the Andrija Puharich and his study of the 9 gods of Egypt. Supposedly, these 9 gods are the gods that also were communicating with Maria Orsic and the Vril that became the Thule Society in Germany. And so there's just, this stuff gets really, really intriguing and deep and highly interconnected.
Right.
So,
well, I'd like to just make a statement, which is you touch on this many times, and I think it's very, very good because it fits in exactly with the beliefs of our program here. Mm-hmm. And that is, and for those of you who are listeners have heard us say this a lot, that it's good to have a healthy skepticism, yes, as well as a good work ethic in your research, and also, an open mind and a willingness to find the truth. And I like that, especially with this stuff. And I think if you listen to our other episodes, you can kind of catch it without us actually explicitly saying it. And that is, it's fun to look into this stuff and kind of let your imagination run wild and, get really into some of the crazy stuff. But, having a level head on your shoulders and asking questions, and especially comparing it biblically, is a good recreational habit.
Well, it is, and I wholeheartedly agree with the sentiment there. I think that, why is it that somebody like me spends all this time studying the strange, as some people say, the highly strange, the wacky? Well, because people believe in it, and people make this stuff their religion. They make it their worldview, their cosmology, and so of course the thesis is that all this stuff connects to the revelation, the revealing of the Antichrist. It gets wrapped into the great deception of the last days. And, as you get into it and you begin to see the historical context and how many people, through deception of what was going on, what Mark Marconi said in 1901, what Percival Lowell was saying, you had all these people channeling beings from Mars and basically telling you all that, all these beautiful green plush valleys on Mars, and they were channeling, supposedly these beings from Mars, and
right,
of course saying things that were just blatantly lies.
Right.
And I have a lot of examples of that, but it becomes a belief system, and that's really the issue. The warning is that, the yellow or the red light should be flashing every time an episode of Ancient Aliens comes on, and there's about 1.5 million to 2 million viewers now of that program that see that program. There's a lot of minds that are being made up that say, "Hey, E.T. is God, and the God of the Bible is just ridiculous." Clearly, there's a scientific reason, and even though we would say it's pseudoscience, nevertheless, there's a lot of people that are out there now buying into this. And according to the scripture, if we're right about this being the last days and that this is the kind of the genesis of the final great deception, then, it's going to become so compelling that even Christians are going to be deceived.
Absolutely. And the Great Deception is a huge part of the Mars talk, and we will definitely get into that a little bit more. But I can just feel it, Gons. I can just feel that you've got something over there.
Yeah, I do, actually. You have a chapter here called Mars and the Freemasons, and we can't have a conversation about strange conspiracies and, occult subjects without bringing in the Freemasons. But here's what caught my attention. And, I love the titles of your subchapters. You have the first one is The Wonderful Worlds of Disney. And
Boom!
So what's going on there?
Well, I talk about I start off exactly right. The Wonderful Worlds of Disney. That is not a typo. That was intentional. Obviously talking about both Earth and Mars. And I explore the connections. I do this kind of as a lead up to the David Flynn discussion, which I go into extensively. But it kind of fits as the good preamble to the whole David Flynn discussion of Cydonia and the Chronicles of Cydonia.
Right.
And that is that Walt Disney became good friends with Werner von Braun. And von Braun had always said that he really didn't want to fire rockets at London. He really wanted to fire rockets to the moon and to Mars. And so anyway, back in the 1950s, Disney and von Braun collaborated on a series of films, pointing to the moon and to Mars, exploring these different worlds. And so Disney was very intrigued about Mars. And I remember as a child, fifth or sixth grade, seeing one of the Disney films and talking about von Braun's theories about different ways that we could get to Mars and how long it would take. And I was just fascinated by that stuff. And I love Disney. I still do love Disney, although I know Disney has, there's a downside to Disney. I'm still a Disney fan. I still like the house, right?
Right.
And so the story gets into how Disney and von Braun were friends. Von Braun, the extensive work that he had done on the project to go to Mars, this vast armada of spaceships, how they would rendezvous, how they would travel to Mars. And the question that I've talked about before is, what was it that was driving von Braun? What was driving his interest in Mars? And the same is true with Willy Ley and a number of the other, and there were many German rocket scientists. You guys probably know that, Project Paperclip brought virtually the entire German rocket contingent, the ones that weren't killed when Peenemünde was bombed by the Allies. They moved everybody to further inland into the dark Black Forest. Right. So they finished doing their rocket work, and to Czechoslovakia, which is another story. So, but anyway, they wanted to go to the moon and to Mars for a very specific reason, and it kind of comes out in Hitler's book Table Talk, where he's being interviewed, and the book may not be a true book, although there are reasons to believe that it probably is true. That Hitler was interviewed, and that these interviews were factual. But he talks specifically about the belief that it would come a time when we would stumble across artifacts on the moon or Mars, and we would prove once and for all that the Jewish religion, of which Christ was just another Jew, that it was false. It was a fabrication.
Because of artifacts on
because
Mars.
Of artifacts, because of tennis shoes, rocks in the shape of tennis shoes on Mars, that religion would be proven to be untrue, and we would discover, kind of the whole plurality of worlds notion that the Vatican, as we talked about briefly earlier, the work Chris Putnam's done and Tom Horn, the Vatican is preparing the world for disclosure, and so that's kind of where von Braun was coming from, is that it's theorized that he really was caught up in the same hope that we could eventually discover our true meaning. And even a scientist, John Brandenburg, he's done a lot of work on the possible catastrophe, a nuclear catastrophe that may have occurred on Mars, which ties into David Flynn and Rahab and the destruction of the adjacent planet and so forth. That even Brandenburg says essentially that when we finally understand the secret of Mars, we will understand the secret of ourselves.
Right.
In a phrase, that's kind of the connection. There is this romantic belief that to really understand our origin and our destiny, that Mars is the key to unlock that.
Right. And so I see here you have electrifying communiques.
Yes, that was the electrifying communiques. That was the Marconi and Tesla story. But the story goes well beyond that. You get into if you want to go down that path, you get into this whole issue of electrogravitic pulse waves.
There it is.
Yeah, there it is. And we're back to Tesla and talking about how the communication. Marconi was working on sort of this analog sound wave concept, which is really the basis of all of our sound waves, TV, radio, etc. But Tesla was working on this concept of a pulse wave, and supposedly the Germans may have implemented this somewhat in their submarines or U-boats. But the idea of a pulse wave is quite different than a sound wave, and I probably should spare, because it could take a long explanation to go into.
Right. We don't need to get into the technical
we don't need to go
stuff.
into weeds. But nevertheless, the idea was that he was developing a different type of wave that could resonate and could communicate. And so it was sort of this idea that was involved in the communications with Martians. But the mythos around Marconi and Tesla goes into the view that they eventually went to South America, actually before the end of World War II, because South America, specifically Argentina, Bolivia, had been a home for many, many Germans that had already immigrated there. So they were very German friendly. Well, supposedly, as the story goes, it's almost images of James Bond and You Only Live Twice. There's this high mountainous volcano at 16,000 feet elevation, where supposedly Marconi and Tesla set up shop, and they continue to develop their new flying machines, and they create flying saucers that take them to the next level. And supposedly this goes on in South America for a considerable period of time, and it gets into all kinds of stuff. I talk a lot about Justice P. Farrell and his theories about the cosmic war, but nevertheless, the Marconi-Tesla story sort of culminates in this theory that Tesla wasn't really killed in his hotel room by two American or German spies,
right?
But that he actually escaped. Marconi picked him up. I don't know if he picked him up in a flying saucer or what, but got him down to South America, and and that they continued to invent wild and crazy things in their the mountain high, 3 mile high, mountain in South America.
Well, that would sure be a happier ending to the story than I am familiar with.
Absolutely. Tesla's quite an interesting character. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So now Gons, I know that Gons has looked into and has researched the subject of drugs, and specifically DMT in regards to things similar to this matter. Gons, why don't you?
Yeah, I mean, you basically, it's one of the later chapters. And then, after we kind of touch on DMT and sort of the spiritual aspect of it, we'll start getting into the Great Deception. I have, I want to hear your take on the biblical matters of where Mars might fit into the Bible. Of course, the David Flynn stuff that we have to touch on. But before we do, I do want to ask you the aliens in inner space, pyramid rituals, DMT, and DNA. What's that all about?
Well, it gets into really tackling the whole issue of the ancient alien religion. And so it's one of the last chapters. There's a chapter right before that where I really get into Aleister Crowley and H.P. Lovecraft and a guy, what's Grant's first name? I'm going to go look here. The Necronomicon, I have to pronounce it correctly, Necronomicon, which was a sort of grimoire, a magical cookbook, if you will, their religious ideas. Kenneth Grant. Yeah, he was a follow-on to Aleister Crowley. But specifically, the idea of inner space, it gets into Philip Coppens, who's the late Philip Coppens. He was one of the featured speakers on Ancient Aliens. We saw him a lot. He had kind of the funny, it was a Belgian accent, long hair.
Long hair, yeah.
Yeah, and he passed away just about a year and a month ago. It turns out he had a very, very unusual, I think it was either kind of a brain or a liver cancer that he had, and unfortunately passed away. He was a very creative thinker. He had done research originally for Picknett and Prince on the Stargate Conspiracy, which was written in 1999, which was, I think, one of the more important books to really challenge some of the Mars mania of Graham Hancock and Richard C. Hoagland. But anyway, Coppens had been one of their researchers. And so I touch on a lot of his theories. And the point I make to begin the chapter is that Coppens was kind of a contrarian to the George, what is it, Zoulas? How do you pronounce George's name? That's the founder. Tsoukalos. Thank you, Tsoukalos. Kind of a contrarian to where Eric Van Dyneken and Tsoukalos and the other guys are. David Hetcher Childress. There's sort of about a half dozen guys that are frequently on Ancient Aliens. Coppens had a different view. He talks about the fact that humankind has been contacting these aliens internally, sort of through inner space. And to some extent, his theory is a bit more attractive because it tends to square with a number of other things we know about the occult and the paranormal. He talks a lot about the pyramid religion, the true meaning of the pyramids. His view was that the pyramids are clearly not monuments erected to, as a result of the death of a pharaoh, but they were, in effect, temples. They were temples in which the pharaoh would enter into the pyramid, and the pyramid was especially constructed to enable the pharaoh to contact the 9 gods, Atum, Ra, Horus, the 9, the Ennead, and to communicate with them, and that it was in his ability to communicate with the 9 that he was therefore qualified to lead the Egyptian empire, that his contact made him divine, and so that he sort of walked and talked with God. And you can kind of see a little bit of a reference to the concept of Enoch and the Book of Enoch and all that. But but that's Coppens' argument that is the true meaning of the Egyptian religion, is that there's this pyramid, and it was only the pharaoh that was able to connect and contact the gods. And as long as he was in connection with the gods, then things were going to be cool in the land of Egypt. And so that's his argument for why the pyramids existed. Now, what's interesting, though, which I point out, which I haven't seen anybody else that had pointed this out, is that he sort of has a internal or self-contradiction, because after he talks about that, he then starts talking about drugs, and he talks about DNA. He talks about DMT, which is dimethyltryptamine, if I remember right. And DMT is a substance that the human body produces naturally, but it's taken up by the human body very quickly, so that once we produce it, there's a counter inhibitor in our body that takes it up so that it doesn't have a very long-lasting effect. Well, it turns out that the ritual concoction that they brew in the Amazon, ayahuasca or there's different ways to pronounce it, but it's a very foul-smelling, tasting brew that has both DMT in it, and it has another drug that basically inhibits the take-up mechanism of the human body, such that the effects of DMT can be very long-lasting. They can last for hours. And so what it does is it's a psychotropic drug. It's not necessarily a psychedelic drug, although some would argue that it is, but it's a psychotropic drug, and it enables an individual to have these extended visions and trances.
Right.
And so you get into a whole new sort of world. He talks about various different people that he had met, and Terence McKenna, probably the most notable. Right. He also is the late Terence McKenna. talks about how through DMT, through these drugs, that one can encounter these beings. And a funny thing in these trances is that these beings are humanoid, but they have this hawk-like head. Some of them do. Some of them look a lot like the icon or the hieroglyph for Horus, which is the bird head man.
Oh, right. Horus.
All right. Oh, Horus. Of course. Not Mr. Ed, but anyway. And then there was the other common symbol or icon would be the snake, the dragon or the snake. And you see the twin snakes. And of course, the supposition he jumps to is that these snakes are in fact the DNA molecule, and that the inner gods, and he goes in to talk about some of the trances and some of the things that people have channeled in these trances, that ties into panspermia, that some great ancient alien being, decided to transport themselves and transpose themselves into DNA molecules, and that they would hide themselves into the millions of life forms on planet Earth by hiding themselves into DNA. Now, you think, well, that's crazy. Well, no, it may be crazy, but it's not. Philip Coppens is not the only guy to believe this. Graham Hancock, in his 2007 book Supernatural, talks a lot about this. His subtitle is more or less Encounters with the Ancient Teachers of Humankind. And so he sort of has the same thing where he goes off and he takes a lot of drugs and he learns all these things. A guy named Daniel Pinchbeck wrote a couple of books, Breaking Open the Head, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl. So you get sort of all these different authors that are very focused on the overlap between the paranormal and the connection with the outer space alien.
Right, absolutely.
So that's where Coppens is going. And of course, I point out that, each of these ideas in their own way are, it's sort of like there's multiple paths to God. There's the pyramid, there's the DMT thing, and then there's sort of this DNA thing. And it's almost as if he argues there's a consistency there, when really there's sort of an inherent inconsistency.
Right.
And, the only consistency is that they all want to say the same thing, which is that God is E.T. It's just that E.T. discloses himself not in let's say UFOs, but he discloses himself in internal vision and trances.
Right.
So Coppens argues that's where he kind of runs counter to the other ancient alien guys, in that he says, you're never going to prove UFOs. We got 50 years and we got a zillion photographs, and it doesn't matter. It's never going to be proven. So what he says is, but the way you can really prove it is you can take these drugs and you can see these talking snakes and bird heads, and once you talk to them, you're going to get the skinny, and then you're going to really know about God. And
that's all the proof I need.
Is his argument. So, and so when you play it as I just did with that much sarcasm, it's actually like I said, in some ways his arguments are kind of more pleasing to the guy that's sort of spiritually attuned than some of the other arguments of ancient aliens. But yet, as I said, it's inherently inconsistent, logically inconsistent, and it's just logically it sounds incredulous to say that.
Right.
Yeah. So that's where he's coming from. And I'll just mention that the prior chapter sets all this up by talking about. We haven't talked about Lovecraft. We probably should talk about Lovecraft, but the idea of Aleister Crowley and Kenneth Grant, their notion of Thelema, their sort of satanic Luciferic religion, all this stuff all connects. It all connects with where Coppens was going with DMT and inner space and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because I believe Tom Horn was the guy who pointed out that Terence McKenna had talked about in the future we won't need to take these psychotropic drugs because we'll have chips in our brains, right? And we'll have direct contact with them. So it all kind of converges.
I'm not sure if I'd agree with Tom on that, although I do agree that, the idea of being chipped and being able to communicate sort of through mental telepathy.
Right.
That's kind of the fringe bleed over between the technology and the paranormal. But yeah, I think that, a lot of people would just would suppose that they're doing that just for sort of the functionality of being able to communicate on the internet wirelessly. This was expressly to be able to contact aliens, and that is the religion of Crowley. It is for that primary purpose. It is to encounter these entities and to demonstrate your power over them, that you can control them. The same that John Dee, who was, Elizabeth I, he was her occultist, magician, and all that. He developed the Enochian magic and so forth. But Crowley was, that's what they were all about. It was about to contact the extraterrestrials that lived interdimensionally, and that is their religion. That is where they get off, is on encountering the others.
Right, absolutely, yeah. Excuse me. Yeah, Jeffrey James actually wrote, he was the one that published the English translation of John Dee and Edward Kelly's, the angel language. And he actually, I actually quote him in the film as well, just talking about different things that are being channeled. And he argues that it's the closest thing to an actual angelic language that he's ever seen. And he actually tried to sort of pitch it to the academics. But, of course, the academics had nothing of it. But,
really cuts down on your grant.
Right.
And when you go that way.
Yeah. I mean, he's a, Jeffrey James is an author for Wired magazine and New York Times and stuff like that. So he's established in that sense. But, but it is interesting because, in my study of, the whole idea of alchemy and technology and stuff like that, it seems as if the whole idea or perception of spirituality is returning, very heavily in the scientific realm. And that's why, I talk about alchemy, because, there's Dr. Rupert Sheldrake and Philip Ashley Fanning, Dr. Fred Alan Wolfe. These are some of the people I quote. And also you got the Dalai Lama talking about it. There's just a lot of people coming out and saying, look, materialism is not the answer. Dr. Charles Taft in 2009 came out with The End of Materialism, How Evidence of the Paranormal is Bringing Science and Spirit Together. So, the whole consensus is that in the next, couple decades or so, materialism is no longer going to be the sort of leading scientific view of reality. And it's going to actually become a little more pantheistic or monistic or something of that nature.
Yeah. Well, certainly you've seen, I've kind of observed, I'm a little older than you guys probably. I've observed this to some extent. The book like The Tao of Physics, there's a Friedrich Capra. There's been a lot of books that have been written over the last 30, 40 years that are, essentially the books behind the New Age, the Aquarian conspiracy. And so these ideas aren't new, but they are gaining new adherents. And there are, as we talked about, there are certain scientific experiments that are beginning to prove. I know Picknett and Prince talk about it in one of their latest books called The Forbidden Universe. They talk about alchemy as the kind of the basis for chemistry and for modern science. Have you read that book, Don?
I actually haven't. That's a really good source.
You need to read that book. It's very clearly written. The Forbidden Universe, and it does a great job of explaining kind of how alchemy fed into the notion of kind of the nature of the universe, and it really does provide a historical kind of context for why scientists are so close to, whether they admit it or not, they tend to be stepping on the toes of the alchemists and the paranormal. They're very, very close together. And so it kind of gives you that context. And so I recommend that. Yeah,
my whole thesis for the film is actually that the Philosopher's Stone is the mark of the beast. So
that's interesting. Well, I'll be anxious to observe your film.
Yeah, it's coming together. Yeah. It's coming together.
That's good.
But moving on, let's dive in a little bit to I guess it ties together some of the biblical aspects of Mars, and also David Flynn, who's so influential in that regard. You cite early on, I think you read in your preface, you quote Ezekiel 28:14, where it says, "You were an anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire you walked." And I know David Flynn was I guess he was one of the first people to suggest that the stones of fire are the planets. Is that a view that you hold on to, or is that just a speculative thing?
Yeah, well, it's both. I mean, I think it's speculative. I don't think you can be dogmatic, but I think it's a very legitimate interpretation of that verse in Ezekiel. We know that that verse in Ezekiel, I believe it's Ezekiel 28, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, 28:14.
Yeah, and then there's of course a whole chapter in Isaiah. I think it's Isaiah 14 that deals a lot with Satan, the five I wills,
right,
and so forth. But yeah, I think the notion that somehow Lucifer was the cherub that oversaw perhaps not just the solar system, but beyond the solar system, but somehow got locked into the solar system and eventually to the Earth itself, and that there was some sort of judgment against Lucifer. And I, by the way, I listened to enough of the program from a year ago to realize kind of the direction you were going to that, and that's pretty much the direction I would go as well. That that there probably was a pre-Adamic race, that there was a planet. The scientist involved was a guy named Tom Van Flandern, and I have a whole chapter on the whole issue of the cosmic war, the theories of Joseph P. Farrell, and the whole issue of how might that have happened, when might it have happened, and so on. So I get into great detail there towards the end of the book, talking about that. But yeah, that's the idea. That's where the asteroid belt came from. I think Flynn was not the first to concoct that idea. That idea has actually been around for a couple of hundred years. That was the supposition, is that there was a planet that's in that gap between Mars and Jupiter, and that it was destroyed somehow. And Mars, of course, shows these telltale signs of a great catastrophe. All kinds of things that suggest that Mars was obliterated at one time. The question is when was it? And I get into a discussion citing the work of Robert Schoch and a few others that have done work to suggest that it might not have been as long ago as Van Flandern suggested. Van Flandern actually suggested there are two exploding planets. One of them exploded 65 million years ago, and it was probably closer in, and it may have resulted in the asteroid that hit Earth and killed the dinosaurs and ended the age of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. If you subscribe to evolutionary time date stamping, you might say. The other one that Van Flandern talked about was the explosion of what is known as either Planet X or Planet K, which was, Flynn called it Rahab. And it was that planet may have blown up 3.2 million years ago, according to the calculations of Van Flandern. Mike Barra, in his most recent book, proposes that the Martian face was hit about 1.35 million years ago. So that's his update. What Farrell talks about, and then there's some pretty good evidence, is that the planet might have exploded as recently as 10 to 12,000 years ago. And that there's evidence that observers on Earth, now this would be a pre-Adamic race, more than likely, intelligent enough to paint, make paintings on walls of caves, that they recorded the event in hieroglyphs and in cave paintings in the Easter Islands, in Egypt, all around the world. There are these evidences that they saw these sort of arcing plasma displays that would look like these sort of giant aurora borealises, but they were impacting the Earth, and they were recorded about 10 to 12,000 years ago. So the supposition for the people that believe in Atlantis and all that was that perhaps there was this great catastrophe. It was recorded by a pre-Adamic race and cave paintings and cave drawings. But as Farrell talks about, he said the issue you've got with Van Flandern's thing is that, let's assume for a second that Van Flandern is correct, there was an exploding planet that happened 3.2 million years ago. It doesn't explain why you had all these observers that probably lived at the latest 20,000 years ago that recorded these sort of cosmic solar events that, the electromagnetic displays in the heavens, and that they were similar, and that they kind of connect to the thunderbolts of Zeus and some other ideas. But those had to have happened within the last, let's say, 10 to 20,000 years, because we can more or less date those cave drawings. And so that catastrophe may well have happened much more recently. So Farrell points that out. So for those of us that subscribe to the concept of the gap theory, the idea that the Earth was somehow disrupted, destroyed, all of life on Earth disappeared, and that God had to come in, and starting with Genesis 1-2, and in effect recreate the Earth, separate the waters from the waters, restore the land, et cetera, so on.
Right.
That is what Genesis is describing, is the recreation of the world, and it happened after this massive destruction on the planet Earth. But the reason it happened on planet Earth is that Earth was hit by the debris field from this exploding planet.
Right.
That may have happened 3.2 million years ago, or may have happened 10 or 12,000 years ago.
Uh-huh.
And it was observed, and then the planet was destroyed. And so it's really an intriguing discussion. And I get into that in the whole discussion of the cosmic war, and try to summarize what is very difficult material. Joseph Farrell's material is very challenging. It's not easy material to read, but I try to summarize it and try to talk about some of the science behind the idea and why it might be, in fact, a viable theory, and how it connects to the whole issue of Mars and so on. But it would obviously dramatically change our views of the origin of humankind if we were able to prove that this planet did blow up and there was a civilization that existed on that planet, and that existed to some extent on the planet Mars, which was earlier just a moon of this planet Rahab,
Right.
and that somehow the debris field, even the water, because supposedly this planet was a water world of type, that it helped create a massive flood on the Earth as the Earth passed through this debris field, and that it was part of the judgment of God against this planet, against Lucifer, against his horde, and that the Earth had to be recreated, and the Homo sapiens sapiens was created with Adam and Eve, and roughly 7,000 years ago.
Huh. That's fascinating. Now, in regards to ETs and beings from or on or what have you, Mars, what do you touch on with that in the book? I mean, with the prevailing theory for the Great Deception sort of ethos is that these are demonic, and some say they're actually physical, some say they're not physical, some say they're more sort of biological robots to be inhabited. I mean, where do you land on that?
Well, it's interesting. We'll go back to Coppens for a second. His ideas, he sort of denies that there could be physicality to these beings, that they're these in the visions and the trances that we have. We see them, we can talk to them, but they're eternal. They're not physical. My view is that they're both. Is that they do come to people in inner visions and so forth, but that they materialize as well. Certainly, if you were to talk to Elie Marzulli, you would see a combination of both. We know that alien abductions, David Jacobs, his research, there's examples where it appears to be purely a journey of the mind. Then there are examples where there are physical artifacts left behind, radiation readings, alien implants, people that are actually missing from their bedroom for several hours. Their families go looking for them, and lo and behold, they pop back up in the bedroom with no memory of what occurred until later under hypnosis. They explain all these alien abduction experiences and so on. So, and I raise a whole bunch of questions. The idea that even if it's true that our minds help to somehow handshake with the paranormal, such that it creates a physical reality that is predominantly paranormal. Certainly, if you go study a lot of the channelers, the mediums, in the 1890s when spiritualism was so popular, there's always this sense that the humans together collectively sort of do a Spockian mind meld, and they sort of bring these entities into our physical world. They leave the ectoplasm behind, the green slime, and so there's sort of a physical attribute, but it takes a lot of mental energy to keep them in this dimension. As soon as that channel is sort of broken, literally, then they sort of dissolve back into a different dimension.
Right.
So there seems to be sort of a doorway, a portal that gets opened, and these beings come into. And certainly, I'm very wary of friends of mine that work in the sort of deliverance realm and spiritual warfare. They will certainly talk about that demons feed off of fear.
Right.
And that, if you are afraid, that supplies, it's like a battery, it supplies charge to their kind of corporeal nature, or becoming sort of corporeal bodies. And so there's some phenomenon there, and I think it's very involved in the UFO thing as well. So, are UFOs physical? Yes. Many times I think they are. Are they interdimensional? I think yes, they are. Is there some sort of paranormal aspect to them? I think definitely there is. And so it's not a pure case of yes or no. It's sort of a combination.
Right. And I was going to ask, just to clarify, in your opinion, how that connects to, say, the Area 51, the ETs who allegedly work with the government on technological things, and or just Mars in general.
Right. Well, this is where you get into, there's a lot of things in my book that I'm able to more or less provide kind of historical substantiation for, and, plausible, this is a plausible theory and this is not. You get into the whole issue of, do the ETs already live among us? Are they already involved in the military? If you talk to someone like Stan Deyo or Steve Quayle, they're certainly going to tell you, I think, unashamedly, and that, yeah, they're already here. They already work. They're already amongst us. The Whitney Strieber, that's written a number of books on this book that he wrote on hybrids. I thought was great, a great fiction, camp. And so I think that there's something to it. I kind of have a wait and see attitude. I suspect that, we haven't talked much about remote viewing, but remote viewing, and the sort of the seeing of these beings, interacting with them, their physicality, I suspect there's something to it. I just don't think we're ever going to prove it, at least maybe not on this side of the rapture if you're a pre-trib person like me. Right. I think it's reserved for sort of the revealing of the Antichrist and the whole new worldview, the whole new cosmology that comes into play when some of these truths or falsehoods are disclosed as truths. Right.
Okay. All right. So you got kind of you're not going to preach it from the rooftops that...
No, I have not personally talked to anyone that's in the military that, and Stan and I think Steve have, that talk about this in detail. I have not had those experiences. Now, I've talked with people from the military, a person in specific that used the remote viewing crew out of the Army intelligence group out of Maryland in the 1970s that existed then, probably still does exist. So I know that is, in fact, that's true. I know that. There's no question about that. But the idea that aliens have been here for some time, that there was, in fact, an alien agreement that was made in the part of the Magic 12, Eisenhower, all that. I just, of course, the big event of this last year was the citizens' hearing on disclosure.
Right, yeah.
Stephen Bassett and all that. There's a lot to that. I think that there are real experiences. I think, the gentleman, Dr. Lear, that works, appears on LA's DVDs in the Watcher series, that removes these implants. Do I believe those implants really are there? Yeah, I actually do. They're very physical. They're very advanced. They appear to have some kind of you might say, either a GPS or a monitoring capability. I don't know. But we don't know exactly what they are, but they seem to be real. They seem to be a result of alien abduction. And so I think there is a physicality and a reality to that. I don't know that even if it's proven that it happens, let's say that, Dr. Lear, because he has these implants, and let's say that a science group, an objective, naturalist, atheistic scientist went in and said, yep, that's, that material is at least 65 million years old. It had to form somewhere in the distant part of the galaxy, which is kind of, by the way, what they say about the material that came through the portal at Rockwell in 1947. that, that this sort of proves that these are beings far away, many light years away. They're from Aldebaran, 65 million light years away, blah, blah, blah. It's just part of, I think, what will be the deception is, we have these physical artifacts that prove that this stuff really happened. It's where they're from, et cetera. So, but my point is, I don't think you're going to see that appear on Fox News or CNN anytime soon. I
don't think so, huh?
Not anytime soon. I think it's part of the signs and lying wonders, which is where the book title comes from, that will appear in the very, very last days. And so I think we're seeing very strong hints that's going to come to pass, but I'm not expecting it to be on popular television, in the next few weeks.
Right. At least not presented as fact.
No, I argue, this whole discussion, I think is a worthy discussion on its own. It'd be fun to do it sometime with Tom Horn in LA about whether disclosure is going to be an all-at-once fanfare. Here it is in your face. The aliens are real. We've had a pact with the aliens. We've been talking to them for years. We work with them and so forth and so on. I just don't think that's going to happen. I tend to believe that disclosure is happening. It's happening slowly. It's continuing to happen. There will be a time where it becomes sort of an incontrovertible fact, but I don't, I just tend to believe in disclosure bit by bit, and that's kind of how I conclude my book.
Yeah, that's interesting because, as LA often talks about, the day the UFOs are over the major cities and it's going to be this big, game changer.
Right.
And, we all sort of have thought about, oh my gosh, what are we going to do that day?
Right.
Are we going to, pull out our Bibles and start running around? So, it's interesting. It's an interesting thing. But I think you're right in that, disclosure is happening. More and more people are actually becoming privy to, the potential realities of extraterrestrials, all this stuff. And I do think that you're right in some sense that I think it'll be artifacts, that are either discovered or, proven to be from an ancient past that is beyond, what we thought and stuff like that. So I think it's both and, it's possible that there will be that day, but, I wouldn't necessarily bank on it. But at the same time, I do think stuff is going on, with the internet and everything else that it is, people are privy to this. The poll in England, last year that said more than 50% of people in England, at least in that poll, said that they believe in aliens more than they believe in God. So, it's already kind of happening in the psyche.
That kind of justifies, why I wrote a book on the subject, because that's what's happening. And it's not being shouted from the mountaintops, but it's creeping in. And I think that is a pretty important empirical data point, that there are more people now that believe in the reality of ET than they believe in the reality of the God of the Bible. If they believe in Jesus at all, they just assume Jesus was an ET.
Right.
And so, that's why we believe that, whether it's disclosed all at once or it's disclosed bit by bit, it is being disclosed. It is changing minds. And what I'm hoping to do is to show through Mars and through the history of this, that this is not, an event that's just happened. It's been going on for a long time. There's a context to it. There's lessons to be learned through this disclosure. How, it is a giant, giant deception, and it's been going on for almost 150 years. And it just happens to be more in our face now than ever before, because our technology, our ability to perceive it, to prove it, our science is the point now where we can begin to verify some of these things. And so it makes its truth, if you will, more compelling to us than ever before. But despite that fact, it's kind of like crop circles. You can argue that Dave and Doug are the guys that out there with their big floppy, feet and boards out there making crop circles, or you can believe that somebody super intelligent has the ability to do that in a matter of minutes and encode all kinds of interesting information in it, and you can decide which of those is the more plausible explanation. So, I think that's kind of what's it's going to come down to, is that we're going to be presented with more and more phenomena that you can't explain naturalistically. The skeptic is going to begin to look like a fool. And that's when it becomes obvious that the Christian is going to have to really decide that what we've been talking about, what we believe about the nature of God, his person, his coming, to us in the form of Jesus Christ to address the problem of evil, not just the problem of being, lack of being centered or being in touch with ourselves, but there really is this problem of evil that, the gospel is the truth or it's not, That's where we're going to be, and we're coming to that point now very rapidly.
Absolutely, definitely. Well, let's wrap things up. One last question for you: Do you see Mars in the Book of Revelation at all anywhere?
Not per se. I don't see it in the Book of Revelation per se. Mars is obviously is the mythology associated with Mars. If we had time, I chose not to write much about this, but there's a very strong historical precedent to suggest that Mars was Nimrod, and Nimrod finds his way into several of the gods, but very likely Mars, Marduk, a number of the gods really reference Nimrod, and so there is this connection between the Antichrist and Mars, the red planet, the planet of war, the god of forces, which is really the god of military forces, in my view, not necessarily the god of pantheistic forces. But so I see lots of connections, but not like, the black sun, blood moon, that there's a blood moon, that's really Mars. No, I wouldn't say that. I think there really will be a series of blood moons that are actually going to be happening here very shortly now in a matter of months. Right. So, but I don't see it per se. But I think Mars, the issue of the artifacts, the stories of Andrew Basiago, all these things are just they are opening the mind. They are breaking open the head, to use Daniel Pinchbeck's term, and they're making our willingness to believe much, much more malleable. So I think people are going to be in a state of eagerness to believe. They're going to find that Judeo-Christian worldview just no longer for them holds water. They want something that they can sink their teeth into that has some evidence, some proof. And lo and behold, ancient alien theory is going to come along and it's going to attempt to give them that proof.
All right. Well, there you have it. That's Douglas Woodward. Thanks a lot, Doug. He's the author of Lying Wonders of the Red Planet, Mars, Ancient Aliens, and the Great Deception of the Last Days. Thanks a lot for coming on the show, Douglas.
My pleasure. Hope to do it again.
Absolutely. And we will hear more from you later. And where can we find your book and what date is it coming out?
Yeah. Well, let's see. It's going to be out probably by January the 12th. Something like that on Amazon. You'll find it there. It'll be sold through Prophecy in the News. Prophecy in the News is also going prophecyinthenews.com. They're also going to make an offer where the lecture I did last summer at Pikes Peak, that conference, will be part of it. And there's also a DVD that I have called Transforming Humanity into Gods that also talks about kind of the religious motivation behind all of this program. And that'll be part of the offer as well. But look for it on Amazon. I have a bunch of books out there. S as in Stephen Douglas Woodward. That's how they find me.
That sounds good. All right. There you have it, folks. You heard it first here on Canary Cry Radio. One more time. Thanks again, Douglas Woodward.
Thank you. It was fast, huh? Lots to talk about.
Yeah, I know.
Get into the cosmic war.
I know, man.
And what all that really means, and the fact that he really probably went to Sheol rather than to Mars, and
oh, wow, yeah, I didn't even.
All kinds of interesting things to talk about. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, we will save that for next time then.
All right.
So many of you are aware of episode 21, where we did, wow, that's a long time ago, Guns.
Yeah, that's 40 episodes ago.
That's incredible. Okay, episode 21 was the Mars episode, and it's just chock full of all sorts of craziness. And this is a great supplement to that. Mr. Douglas Woodward himself said that episode 21 was worth giving a listen to. So if you haven't done that, we'll put the link down in the show notes. Make sure to go to canarycryradio.com and check that out. And there you go. You'll be all caught up on your Mars conspiracy and spiritual significance / crazy people information. Well, there you have it, folks. Thanks for listening to this episode of Canary Cry Radio. And make sure to tune in next time time for another awesome episode. And until then, think outside the cage.
The views and opinions expressed by the authors and guests on this program are not necessarily those held by the hosts of Canary Cry Radio or its community.
Make sure to visit canarycryradio.com for show notes, episode archives, forums, and more.
You can contact us by clicking on the contact tab or emailing us directly at canarycryradio@gmail.com.
If this episode touched your life, your worldview, or your beating little heart in any way, please consider supporting the show financially. You can do so by visiting canarycryradio.com and clicking on the support tab.
There you can sign up for a small monthly donation.
Or, if commitment is just not your thing, you can leave a one-time donation in any amount.
Canary Cry Radio is and will always be free, so your support, and we need it really bad right now because I lost my job, is what keeps us on the air.
So make sure to catch the next episode of Canary Cry Radio. Until then, think outside the cage. I had a lot of coffee this morning.
Apparently. What kind of coffee are you having?
Coffee's a heck of a drug, everybody.
Crack coffee?
Mars, 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 Mars. That's me communicating with Martians. Mars, 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 Mars. That's their whole language.
Smars is the word they have. So
Mars, 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 Mars.